This is the story about a Welshman who was a high-ranking army officer during the Napoleonic Wars. There's nothing particularly unusual about that. He was not the only one. But there is something that makes his story special. According to one contemporary soldier, he was the most admirable spy that was ever attached to an army. He was a man with some exceptional talents. He was a remarkable linguist and apparently had the most superb memory. And he used these gifts for espionage. A few of the things attributed to him sound a little bit hard to believe, but it would appear that most of his story is indeed true. As a military officer and a spy, he was, perhaps, a bit like an early 1800s version of, well, you know who. I know that a reference to spying and James Bond is predictable and somewhat unoriginal, but I'm going to make it anyway. So, a question is, could this man really have been anything like a Napoleonic era 007? Well, here is his story. See what you think. John William Waters was born in 1774 in Glamorganshire, South Wales. His birthplace was said to be near Welsh St Donats, although some other nearby places have also been claimed. His family seemed to have been reasonably well-to-do, but his father died young. And so, when he was only about 13, that great landowner, the Marquis of Bute, got him a commission in the army, specifically, given the Marquis's Scottish roots, the 1st Royal Scots Foot Regiment. The youngster was sent with his regiment to Portugal, where he surely picked up some of the language. Then, promoted to lieutenant, he served in the little-remembered and historically complicated Anglo-Russian invasion of Holland in 1799. 3 years later, there were British Army mutinies in Gibraltar. Walters had a role in restoring order. Then he spent some time in the West Indies colonies, was promoted to captain, and sailed back to Britain. Waters was making a name for himself. He had obviously done some good work. He then became aide-de-camp, that is, a personal assistant to the Marquis of Londonderry, a cavalry commander, and in 1808 he found himself back in Portugal. This was in the early stages of the Peninsular War, in which Spain, Portugal and Britain fought the invading French under Napoleon. And it was here that Waters became, in effect, an intelligence officer. He was given the job of spying on the French forces and trying to discover as much as he could about their campaign plans. On one occasion, he intercepted a letter which had been sent by the French commander and gained valuable information, valuable enough to change the British Army's plans. He was promoted to major and then attached to the Portuguese army as an intelligence officer with the rank of lieutenant colonel. By now he appears to have been fluent in Portuguese and Spanish. His talents were much appreciated. The British commander, the Duke of Wellington, wrote of Waters. He has made himself extremely useful to the British Army by his knowledge of the languages of Spain and Portugal, and by his intelligence and activity. I have employed him in several important affairs, which he has always transacted in a manner satisfactory to me, and his knowledge of the language and customs of the country has induced me to send him generally with the patrols employed to ascertain the position of the enemy, in which services he has acquitted himself most ably. In other words, Waters was not a behind-the-lines headquarters kind of officer. No, he was out there, mingling with local people, no doubt very close to the enemy, taking great risks to gather valuable information for the Allied campaign. In one episode at Portugal's great river Douro, the Allies, under threat by the French, had no boats to cross the water. Waters found a local man with a small boat. He managed to cross the river undetected, presumably at night, and somehow obtain 3 much-needed barges. The exact details of this mission are unclear, but he was much admired for it. The Welsh author John Rhys Gronw, an army contemporary of Waters in the Peninsular War, wrote glowingly of the man in his memoirs, although I'm unsure whether they knew each other personally. Gronw wrote of Waters, "He was one of those extraordinary persons that seem created by kind nature for particular purposes. He was the most admirable spy that was ever attached to an army." In flowery prose he added, he could assume the character of Spaniards of every degree and station, so as to deceive the most acute of those whom he delighted to imitate. Using his imagined stereotypes, Gronw continued, "His acquaintance with the Spanish language was marvellous. He could assume any character that he pleased. He could be Castilian, haughty and reserved; the Asturian, stupid and plodding; the Catalonian, intriguing and cunning; the Andalusian, laughing and merry. In short, he was all things to all men." And, according to Gronw, Waters had also mastered the French language, with a strange observation. But as he spoke the language with a strong German accent, he called himself an Alsatian, referring to the Alsace border area of France and Germany. Perhaps Waters, the very competent linguist, had in fact mastered German, but I can see no evidence for that. Waters was obviously an exceptionally gifted linguist, but can it be true that he would blend in with the locals, bearing in mind the Iberian Peninsula's various languages, numerous regional accents, and localized slang? It does sound like an exaggeration, but it's also evident that he could, at the very least, get by. Gronw then tells us in his book about Waters' other skill, his extraordinary memory. What rendered him more efficient than all was his wonderful power of observation and accurate description, which made the information he gave so reliable and valuable to the Duke of Wellington. Nothing escaped him. When, amidst a group of persons, he would minutely watch the movement, attitude, and expression of every individual that composed it. In the scenery by which he was surrounded, he would carefully mark every object. Not a tree, not a bush, not a large stone escaped his observation. And it was said that in a cottage he noted every piece of crockery on the shelf, every domestic utensil, and even the number of knives and forks that were got ready for use at dinner. Such a memory, if he really was that good, would come in very handy indeed for a spy. But one day Waters' luck ran out, at least temporarily. He went out on a reconnaissance mission, either alone or with a small patrol group, and this time he was spotted and captured by French dragoons. And there are 2 versions of what happened next. The simpler one is that he was being taken to the city of Salamanca on horseback under the guard of 4 gendarmes. Suddenly, Waters saw an opportunity and bolted. Pistol shots by his pursuers failed to find their mark. He rode into a woodland and gave them the slip. Gronw, who also served in this campaign, gives us a more colourful version. It is that while Waters was kept under guard, he pretended to be unable to understand French or Spanish. The guards therefore spoke freely in front of him. When at a mill, he overheard that they planned to rob him, shoot him, and tell their officers that he had tried to escape. Waters knew that he had to get away very quickly. Gronow then tells us that while the French were distracted, Waters threw his hat and cape onto a bush as some kind of distraction, jumped onto a horse that was carrying a bag of flour. The full details of this story are lengthy, very convoluted, and frankly preposterous. But it's worth remembering that Gronow was not always the most reliable of sources, and he had a book to sell. Anyway, Waters did manage to find his way back to headquarters, where he was said to have been greeted by a very pleased Duke of Wellington. He was promoted again, this time to brevet lieutenant colonel. Soon after, Waters saw action in several of the fiercest battles of the Peninsular War, including those of Badajoz and Salamanca, where he was acting adjutant general and presumably active in his specialities of reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. During one battle, he was actually wounded while in conversation with Wellington. His skills and bravery resulted in him being mentioned in dispatches by the Duke, receiving awards and being made a companion of the Order of the Bath. The Peninsular War was eventually won, but as we know, Napoleon wasn't finished, and soon enough Waters found himself back in action with his former commander, the Duke of Wellington. This time they were together at that famous Battle of Waterloo in 1815, and once again Waters was an acting adjutant general. After that victory, Waters' years of warfare and spying were over, at least as far as we know. In 1830 he became a major general and soon after captain of Yarmouth Castle on the Isle of Wight. Further honours came his way and he was a lieutenant general by 1841. He died a year later at the age of 68 and was buried in Kensal Green, London. I can find no reference as to whether he married and had a family. John Waters is, I'm somewhat surprised to say, almost totally forgotten today. And now I'm going to return to that question I posed at the beginning of the video, one that I admit sounded a bit silly. Can he really be regarded as a Napoleonic era 007? Well, this was a military officer. His speciality was spying. He took some tremendous personal risks. He was captured, escaped, and saw a lot of action. Well, doesn't that description also fit the fictional James Bond pretty well? So perhaps the 007 reference isn't so far-fetched after all. Thanks for watching.